There is literally a blimp of Boris Johnson flying over this seat that's been Labour for nearly 100 years. It is a nightmare. Keir Starmer goes back to London, tells his staff, I'm going to resign.
Have you ever wondered who Keir Starmer really is? Well, the thing you've got to understand about Keir Starmer is that he never expected to...
Keir Starmer was 16-1 at the start of that campaign.
Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund have spent years following all the breadcrumbs.
I think he's profoundly disinterested in politics, but he is capable of acting politically.
There is a Starmerism, it's a hatred of that sort of thing. It's sort of, why can't you be more serious?
Uncovering the real power behind the curtain. To really understand Starmer, you've got to understand this guy, Morgan McSweeney.
It starts with a man called Morgan McSweeney climbing the stairs to the leader of the opposition's office, going to meet Jeremy Corbyn in 2019.
The unexpected feuds.
Keir Starmer's team did not trust Angela Rayner. There was a diplomatic cable in which Joe Biden accused Boris Johnson of...
And the deals that made him Prime Minister.
The deep state, the establishment, the relationship between the royal family and government, the relationship between government and intelligence.
Make sure you subscribe so we can continue to get bigger and bigger guests.
Patrick, Gabe, welcome to Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. Congratulations on a great book, Get In. Where did the name come from?
We were in the offices of our publisher, Penguin, about 14, 15 months ago now, late 2023, and we wrote a book about the Corbyn project and its decline and fall called Left Out. And we wanted it to be not necessarily implying that they were a sequel, it's not Left Out to Electric Boogaloo, but something that had the same feeling to it. And we did suggest writing, because this is about the right of the Labour Party taking back control. But we were told no normal person is going to understand that distinction. And because of Keir Starmer's love of football, because of the imperative to get into government above all else, we sort of settled on that.
And also, the cartoon is brilliant at the front of it. What does it sort of resemble? What's the kind of logic behind it?
I think one of the question marks which hovers over the tome is, who is Keir Starmer? And there are many faces to him. There are many iterations of Starmer and Starmerism. But I think that this sort of is an attempt to capture both the unknowability of the man, but also the extent to which, at times, it has been part of the project to present one version of the leader to the membership, even if the political direction was always going to head in a different direction thereafter. Perhaps the public needed to be told a certain thing, even if it was known that the letter of economic policy would head in a sort of contrary direction as well. So it's an attempt to capture some of the essence of his. For our last book, we had a bit of a crash bang wallop, lots of sound clouds and smoke and a El Gato, Corbyn's cat, on the cover, but This is an attempt to be a little bit more sober and serious as well.
And what is Starmerism? Because you two probably know him better than almost anyone else, right? Given the detail in the book and the amount you've done on it. So what is Starmerism?
Great question, and it's one Keir Starmer himself in the book, very early on, responds to the accusation that Starmerism might exist by telling Jeremy Corbyn's negotiating team just after he suspended him, there's no such thing as Starmerism, and there never will be. I have no ideology at all. He was very resistant to this idea that he was defining himself on the left or the right of the Labour Party. Ed Miliband has said before, there is no ism and he's nobody's ite. So it's a really interesting question. I mean, over the course of the book, this question does recur, i.e., what's it all for? Even Morgan McSweeney, who I'm sure we'll get on to, the most influential aide in this story, defines himself and Starmer by what they are against, not necessarily what they are for. And the closest we come, I think, to a distinct Starmerism that comes from Keir Starmer himself is in a chapter towards the end called Why Us, which is about the 5 missions for government Labour once talked about. I think they talk about milestones or priorities or foundations or something else now, or another abstract noun. And it was all about Keir Starmer being 30 points ahead in the polls, but nobody knowing what he stood for, as late as 2023. And there was this long period where, thoughtful Blairites like Peter Hyman were parachuted into the leader's office and they were all thinking, how can we make this project authentically Keir? And they settled on these 5 missions that were all about ignoring the media, which is very Starmer, and fixing Britain for the long term and not necessarily being partisan about it. And the clearest distillation of how he thinks about politics and how he approaches it is not from that ideological standpoint. It's not thinking, well, Blair would have done this and Brown would have done this and Attlee would have done this. This is what I do. It's Peter Hyman who told us, look, Keir is an experiential politician, by which he meant he finds it really difficult to get animated about things in the abstract, which is basically all the Labour Party does all the time. And what instead, the angriest he gets, the most animated he gets, is if he sees something for himself. He went to Old Day Hospital in Liverpool, the Children's Hospital, and saw kids under general anaesthetic because their teeth had rotted and they couldn't get a dental appointment. And he came back to Westminster and said, we need to sort this out. That's how we get, that's got to be the core of our policy offer. So that's sort of, it's a sort of a man who's learning on the job in real time, and it's all about questions of competence and what works, and which means it's quite hard to categorise because it's, it's syncretic, it changes, and so the only thing that makes it hang together is, almost that old Herbert Morrison quote: "Socialism is what a Labour government does." But that means it's quite hard to put it in one box or another.
One of the interesting things, speaking to sort of senior people in Westminster, they said, the thing you've got to understand about Keir Starmer is that he never expected to be Prime Minister. And I said, not if you've read the Get In book, right? But it's very different, actually, because there is this perception he goes into politics much later, he goes into it for public service, and so on. But actually, you make the case in the book that he set out very much to be Prime Minister.
That's quite right. I mean, we definitely depict this long-standing yearning to be Prime Minister, to be in the top job. Mm-hmm. The only constant in the course of Starmer's political career, and the slightly chronologically longer tale of Starmer contemplating a political career, is his desire to get to the apex. We chronicle the fact that in 2006 he trooped into Gordon Brown's treasury, went to the canteen, spoke to Jonathan Ashworth, who was the then Chancellor's emissary, and they were contemplating whether Gordon Brown might be able to avail himself of Starmer's services as he assembled a government of all the talents. And Ashworth asked, what is it that you wish to do? And Starmer sort of fumbled about for an answer and contrived something along the lines of, well, I'm quite interested in environmental law. But yeah, as we've noted, he does find it difficult to put a fine point on the why, but the desire to be there, to ascend to the very top, is borne out again and again over the years. I think it must have been around 2014, Ed Miliband was contemplating whether Starmer might wish to serve as a peer. And the message that came back from those who knew Starmer well was, don't even bother, because Starmer Keir would never go into the upper chamber. It's only the Commons for him. Keir wants to be Prime Minister. And perhaps most striking is what happens shortly after he gets into Parliament. Because I actually remember, I think the Sunday Times News Review did a pretty textured interview with him talking about, he's quite an unusual guy. A lot of people in Labour politics are completely conversant in the factional identity and all the nuances, social nuances, ideological nuances of Labour politics. Here's a guy who's run the CPS, who's had a career of his own. Might he be, king over the water, future leader? This was just after he'd been selected as the candidate in Holborn and St Pancras. But you sort of assume that though that's written about you, or though that was written about Starmer, there's no way that he was actually thinking about the leadership in explicit terms as early as then.
Yeah.
But he was. His first parliamentary staffer, Chris Ward, helped Starmer prepare for Prime Minister's questions and schooled him in how to respond to a budget as early as his first year in the Commons, which, there are all these people in the book that accuse Starmer of not being sufficiently political. Well, he's the guy who, literally within weeks of arriving in SW1 was thinking, how do I upskill? How do I improve myself so that when the time comes, when I'm at the dispatch box leading the Labour Party, I can make a decent fist of it. Which is
Hence his voice coach, by the way.
Yes.
The big story from this book that we accidentally happened across. It's as that desire to upskill and self-improve and recognise one's weaknesses. I imagine he'd be a fun person to line manage because he'd always be want to hit his KPIs.
yeah.
By the way, we have said this before, but we engage in a fair amount of ritual self-flagellation. Our best story had nothing to do with us.
Yeah, so tell us about this, because some of our listeners might not be aware of it, but you've basically inadvertently broken quite a big story, which has given Conservative campaign headquarters something to do for 2 weeks.
It has. Well, I know your listeners have their eyes trained on much bigger structural forces than the weekly peaks and troughs of life in Westminster. But yeah, we reported that Starmer had retained the services of a voice coach, a woman called Leonie Mellinger, a Shakespearean actress, and she was in and out of his parliamentary office and part of his campaign team from about 2019 until 2022 or 3. And my editor at the Sunday Times suggested we contact her after he read the book. We'd only dedicated a single line to their relationship, but in his great wisdom, he said, "Well, I mean, how on earth have you not gotten her on the record? I mean, what a fascinating, also quite an intimate story, because to have the vulnerability to say to somebody, my voice or my personality doesn't enable me to connect emotionally.
I can't speak. I freeze in front of crowds. I can't address crowds. I'm so wooden. Help me, basically." And she did. But yeah, we went to her, and again, we did this interview during which she said, I was actually really close, involved with so many of the big speeches. We call her a voice coach, but actually she was part of his communications team as well.
Yeah. Performance coach.
Yeah, exactly. And she sort of was like, I was in there for every speech. Even during COVID, I went in, and we thought, oh, well, that shows you this secret member of Keir's Inner Circle. That's how involved she was. And then within about 5 minutes of the story going up.
The fatal error on her part, or maybe fatal overstates it, but she did supply a picture of herself wearing a mask in Labour HQ on Christmas Eve 2020, which, to address your question, prompted some questions from Conservative campaign headquarters as to whether that had adhered to the letter of the then COVID restriction.
So what's the latest with the story? Because there is also a fascinating bit in the book about sort of the Durham Beergate and all that side of things. But it is funny how these sort of political history can turn on very sort of what seemed like quite innocuous moments at the time.
Yeah, the police have already said they're not going to investigate any breach of lockdown by Keir Starmer. I think written into the legislation was some sort of statute of limitation. So even if the Met wanted to, we have, in perhaps overshooting our original deadline for this book, ruined CCHQ's chances of nailing that one, we're afraid.
But yeah, it's interesting how people's jobs work out. And with understanding Keir Starmer, you don't actually meet him until page 40 of the book. To really understand Starmer, you've got to understand this guy, Morgan McSweeney. So tell us a bit about him, because a lot of people won't have heard of him.
Yeah, so Morgan McSweeney is now the most powerful unelected man in Britain. But that was never inevitable. As you say, he's managed to maintain, even now, a pretty low profile compared to his predecessor as Number 10 Chief of Staff Sue Gray, compared to some of the Tories who've done that job, like Dominic Cummings in the past. But as you say, the book starts not with Keir Starmer deciding he wants to be leader of the Labour Party. It starts with a man called Morgan McSweeney climbing the stairs to the leader of the opposition's office, going to meet Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. And we deliberately chose that because this is a story that does not begin with Keir Starmer in a literal sense. And lots of people who reviewed the book have said, this seems like Keir Starmer is a supporting actor in Morgan McSweeney's story. And to a certain extent, if you look at it in the broadest possible sweep, he is, because Morgan McSweeney, man from a very small town in West Cork or Mid Cork in Ireland called Macroom, a slacker at school, went to London, accidentally fell into employment at the Labour Party after an internship, and then was called back when the receptionist of Party HQ dropped a vase on her foot. Nobody really knew who he was. Peter Mandelson would walk past him every day, not saying hello. He was sent to work in terrible by-elections that Labour started to lose as the country fell out of love with Tony Blair. And over the course of the noughties, this young Irishman who's sort of learnt how to work on a kibbutz in Israel on his gap year, has a new work ethic, having been a slacker with dreadlocks as a teenager. He applies himself as a political organiser just as the country is falling out of love with the Labour Party, with New Labour, that had only known how to win. And he's at the canary in the coal mine. He's in Brent East when the Liberal Democrats win because of the Iraq War. He's in Lambeth, one of the flagship councils of the hard left in the 1980s, where the leader, Red Ted Knight, one of Jeremy Corbyn's mates, had overseen a big child abuse scandal that lots of people, including an official government report, blamed on their sort of ideological indulgence. And Morgan McSweeney, over that decade, over that cycle, he goes to the Barking and Dagenham where Labour is losing to the BNP, and over the course of several electoral contests, Lambeth in 2006, when it's the only council Labour gains, Barking and Dagenham 2010, when the BNP loses all its council seats, Morgan McSweeney is learning that the Labour Party, be it the Blairites or the hard left, lose really badly when they look inwards and they don't talk to or reflect on what the voters really want and what they're actually saying, not what they think they're saying, not what they think they ought to be saying. And that sort of leads him, as the 2010s develop and Ed Miliband is flailing around, he has a very clear sense of where Labour needs to be, and it's not yet where most mainstream Labour politicians are. And he sort of, by process of elimination, spends the Corbyn years with lots and lots of money, polling the membership, trying to work out who could be the person to take on Jeremy Corbyn, who is the ultimate evidence, by the way, that the Labour Party is not thinking about voters, but at the same time that the right of the Labour Party, the Blairites, are looking at Labour members and not thinking about them either. They are their voters, and they're saying, oh, no, you're all weird and Marxist, whatever. And then, he alights on Keir Starmer through Labour Together, and the rest is history.
I mean, it's amazing how he goes from basically being, Labour HQ receptionist to chief of staff to the Prime Minister, right? Like, it's an extraordinary kind of winding tale. And the bit about Labour Together is fascinating in lots of ways. I mean, the bit I would like to sort of drill down into is the sort of business leaders that get involved with this point. I mean, you talk there about him sort of, having quite a lot of money, etc. Like, Labour Together is essentially this sort of like third party kind of organisation that McSweeney.
It's sort of the closest thing I think in British politics we'd have to like an American super PAC.
Yeah,
it's quite hard to categorise otherwise.
Well, I think to be fair, sorry, go on.
No, please.
So it's a pretty unusual organisation by Westminster standards for one reason, which is that nobody found out what it was up to or had any sense as to its significance until well after it had fulfilled its core objective.
Yeah.
It existed for two reasons. The first was to manipulate and shape discourse within the Labour Party so that in due course the membership might be prepared to have a conversation about a non-Corbynite leader. And in McSweeney's mind, that meant detoxifying the conversation within the left by destroying some of the Corbynite blogs and websites that were constantly propagating conspiratorial pro-Corbyn propaganda. And then it involved producing a candidate which the membership could tolerate. And I think the thing which for us makes McSweeney quite a compelling character is over the course of this period, there are a lot of people in the Parliamentary Labour Party and on the backbenches who would routinely hyperventilate on broadcast about why Corbyn was a moral aberration, why his pronouncements on Skripal or anti-Semitism were inadequate. But what very few of them did was consider, well, given the extent to which we despise Corbyn, what can we do to win the party back? Most of those who felt that Corbyn was a moral aberration concluded that Labour itself might be a spent force. McSweeney shared their disquiet and shared that depth of hostility towards the politics that Corbyn represented, but he then said, well, let's examine the membership. Let's try and prize the mythology about who they are apart from the reality. And he mentioned business leaders. Yeah, with the help of some very well-heeled and generous philanthropists, he spent tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of pounds on polling, the likes of which had never been done, in order to determine, are the Labour membership, which had risen to an unprecedented figure under Corbyn, are they composed of deranged Trotskyists, conspiratorialist types who hand out Julian Assange flyers outside Labour Party conference, wear shorts and have socialist worker pamphlets on their person at all times? Or actually, is it possible that is part of the membership but not all of it? And what he eventually developed, by the way, was a sort of taxonomy of who that membership was, and it was more nuanced than some of, I plead guilty here, some of the media's depictions might have had people believe. He did accept, McSweeney, that there was a faction within the membership that was hyper-ideological, was more likely to harbour anti-Semitic views. There's some super interesting research which we examined, which showed that a lot of these people had problems sleeping at night, that when asked if they disagreed with the George Osborne purportedly saying he'd like Theresa May chopped up and put in a freezer, most of them thought that was fine. They generally were less bothered by sort of apparently violent language. But he said these hard left people were only one part. He called them the ideologues. He said there were also the instrumentalists or the pragmatists who were the Blairites. But his position was that the kingmakers within the party coalition were the idealists, people who coveted a slightly fairer, better world, a new politics, a better kind of economy. And sure, they fell into Corbyn's arms because he was the only person, it seemed, in 2015 prepared to articulate a politics that wasn't New Labour. But McSweeney's view was, we can get somebody who can plead fealty to Corbyn and Corbynism, but who can appeal to that latent desire among the idealists to win.
Yeah.
He always predicted Corbyn would lose, by the way. He said, well, at some point, these people, they're going to want to give effect to their principles. So let's find somebody who appears to share the principles while having a greater chance of winning. And there are only a handful of people by 2019 who appeared capable of doing that. Emily Thornberry might have been one. Some people thought that she had a lot of the kind of credentials to go the distance. Becky Long Bailey, Angela Rayner, but really Starmer was the man that McSweeney identified as being the plausible, the essential idealist candidate, and the rest, excuse the cliche, is history.
It is amazing how Becky Long Bailey has gone from almost being the favourite at the start of that contest to sort of almost being kind of an irrelevance now.
Yeah, Keir Starmer was 16-1 at the start of that campaign. It's sort of like listening to some of the aides who really believed in it at the time is like listening to Leicester fans who put 10 around it, 5,000 to 1. Yeah,
it's fascinating. But by the way, I mean, what that speaks to is that it wasn't just within parliamentary Labour Party. In general, nobody in the public or indeed the bookies quite understood who these members were. And maybe, I mean, I can't speak to the odds makers and their thought process, but it's very possible that everybody was taken in by the idea that the continuity candidate just would win. And I think McSweeney had a slightly subtler appraisal of what they wanted.
That is a classic group thing that does happen in Westminster, though, right? And I always think about it, obviously, my background and knowledge is the Conservative Party, but there is definitely a kind of like media stereotype of the sort of tweed-wearing former captain of the army, kind of wants low taxes, low regulation, etc. And that caricature that's there, and that does exist. But actually, there's also like, the vast majority of people will have served in local council and are actually quite practical when it comes to it. Aren't as ideologically driven as you think. I mean, who knows? The problem is that the parties themselves have a lot of difficulty, right? Like pulling all this data together. But tell us a bit about the business leaders that kind of got involved with Labour together and so on, because I found that really interesting of a way that business can kind of like impact politics and so on.
Well, the two key people who Morgan McSweeney has to thank for keeping him in a job for the Corbyn years, for the wilderness years, and making all of this very expensive polling possible are Sir Trevor Chin, who best known as a philanthropist now, but made his fortune selling what was then the Royal Automobile Club back in the early noughties. And Trevor Chin he's a practicing Jew. He is very committed to his faith and interfaith relations and that sort of thing. And what drove Trevor Chin to donate to the Labour Party, or particularly that bit of the Labour Party, was having been on an Al-Qaeda hit list, he was pretty disgusted and to some extent terrified about what a Corbyn government could mean for British Jews like him. So devoting yourself to a cause that is looking to rebuild the Labour Party after Corbynism and make sure that whatever politics replaces Corbynism doesn't look like it or doesn't have those sorts of views. You can see why he did it. The other guy is a hedge fund multimillionaire called Martin Taylor, who deliberately keeps a very, very low profile. It's very hard to find a picture of him. I think he's done one interview, which was about a decade ago, in which he said, look, hedge fund managers like Ed Miliband too. I think he might have been the only one. He grew up in a pretty poor background in Greenwich. In the middle of the last century. I think actually he's a bit younger than that, but to give you the full Billy Elliot treatment. But he, I think, just wanted to see a sensible Labour government elected. And this is a guy, by the way, one of the, you get splashes of colour all over books like this, but just to give listeners an idea of how wealthy this guy is, he wears Lycra cycling gear in the headquarters of his funds because the computers get so hot, expending all the energy trying to make money. It's too hot to wear a suit in Martin Taylor's office, apparently. Yeah, exactly.
We spoke to people who said that they're actually complementary but distinct personalities. Chin is all about relationships, and he has relationships which might confound and surprise people. It's not just McSweeney who he became close to. He's got a profound personal relationship with Angela Rayner as well, and in a way, I think perceives himself as being a more sort of old school captain of industry who would bring trade union representatives into the boardroom, into his office to hold court, discuss. I think he, in his own work, not only at the RAC but at CBC Capital Company, I think he spent the latter part of his career at. I think he sort of always sought to have workers, representatives, at a boardroom level, and I think that for that reason, he actually had more of a commonality with the likes of Rayner, who'd come through the trade union movement, than one might foresee for by the way, former member of the Tory party and close personal friend of Tony Blair himself. Taylor, much more policy oriented. He's a big funder of the IPPR, which we've spoken about Labour Together having a slightly nebulous status. I think the Institute for Public Policy Research is sort of the ultimate Starmerite think tank, and Taylor has bankrolled them for a long time, and I think his politics are quite Milibandite in sort of attempting to find I won't use the word third way, but trying to sort of produce a capitalism that is far fairer and more redistributive than that which the Tories might opt for. So they're quite interesting characters, these two men, and as Patrick said, I mean, essentially they took a bet on McSweeney.
Yeah.
They said at a given point in time, you're a pretty wacky character in local government. You appear to have a very clear-eyed assessment of how the party can get back into government. We'll fund your salary for a bit. Let's see what happens.
And what was unusual, by the way, about Chin and Taylor was that at that time, a lot of leftish liberal donors were looking at the Labour Party and saying, this is done.
Yeah.
And in that, they were encouraged, by the way, by people like Tony Blair, people like Jonathan Powell, who were trying to set up something new at the time. They were chucking money at the Lib Dems.
New parties popping up everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. The independent group, Change UK. And, McSweeney spent a lot of his time, he already had Chin and Taylor's money in the bank, but it was sort of going around donors and saying, you are, I'm trying to save the Labour Party from a shipwreck here. Your new party's not a lifeboat because I'm going to blow up the lifeboat, because we need to prove that the Labour Party can be saved, and that this Corbyn period is not permanent realignment. It's a blip. It's a historical blip. And at the time, we all remember what it felt like at the time. At the time, that felt like a crazy suggestion, but sort of, 7 to 10 years hindsight behind us, you can see that he was onto something there.
He delighted, by the way, in waving around a glossy brochure which had been leaked to him, was prepared by one of the advocates of British En Marche, a sort of centrist new party, and he said, this stuff is preposterous. It's like, this is pre-ChatGPT, but nowadays you'd say it was like ChatGPT had generated it. He said, this stuff is a joke. We've got to destroy not only what Blair's former advisors are up to, but we're going to have to, at some point, go toe-to-toe with Blair himself, because we cannot let this idea get off the ground.
Friend of the show, Tony Blair.
Yeah, friend of the pod.
We'll give him his right reply.
But let's just go into a bit more of the sort of like the Labour Party's relationship with business, because one of the sort of bits of the book that jumped out at me was when you were talking about the sort of various reshuffles, that partly the shadow cabinet were ranked on the amount of meetings they'd had with business.
Yeah.
And I thought, gosh, that's interesting.
Well, and that comes from Keir Starmer himself. In the summer of 2021, after the Hartlepool by-election disaster, there's a sense he's finally woken up to oh God, I can't unite this party because it's a complete basket case organisationally. And he commissions senior officials at Labour HQ, several of which are now running the party altogether now, say, can you just do me an audit, as you say, of how good my shadow cabinet are, how good they are in the media, are they meeting with business? And you had, at the time, this in 2021, I think the line that we were told by one of the people who did this review was, you had people not replying to businesses, people turning up late with their cameras off, people turning up to meetings and slagging businesses off. Now, it's the Labour Party, of course, so culturally it's sometimes difficult, but it was pretty shocking in some respects hearing that sort of amateurism. Yeah. Which, by the way, if there is a Starmerism, it's a hatred of that sort of thing. It's sort of, why can't you be more serious like I am? But and it's interesting. And also, go on to talk about a reshuffle in which Ed Miliband is shifted precisely because businesses don't much like him and he doesn't much like many of them.
Yeah. And that was also a classic thing of Miliband's leadership as well. That was a problem. So they put all this kind of like effort in, and Jim O'Neill had a great quote this morning on the radio talking about they've made business feel really warm and fuzzy about it. It's not gone like that in the kind of like 8 or 9 months since government. It's gone pretty sort of fractious. What do you make of the current kind of relationship between business and Labour?
So there's no doubt that there was good faith from both sides going in. And in a way, I'd sort of reflect on the government's relationship with business in a not dissimilar vein in which I'd reflect on its relationship with the public. There are two commodities you can never recover in the first 6 months or year of a premiership: goodwill, good faith, and momentum. And the party did needlessly squander them in its public and political profile because of the dysfunction at the heart of Downing Street at the start of the administration, all that controversy about spectacles, dresses, and freebies. But also it sort of sacrificed so much of what it had with the business community as well because of the budget. And I'm sure that you would ask me about ask us about national insurance increases and the implications of that on not just relations with business but on the economy full stop. And we are at the point now where even the Bank of England itself has expressly stated that measures in that budget had a depressing effect on the dynamism of the economy. So in the end, it's sort of self-evident that relations are better than that they were in Corbyn era, but given that requires one to exceed the threshold of 0 or less than 0, no, I think in the end, the opposition in a way is frustrating. Your friend, you mentioned the friend of Tony Blair. I think he routinely bemoaned the fact that the greatest frustration of opposition is that you cannot, in actual fact, do anything. You are left then to use your party as a sort of form of performance art. If you can discipline your party, run your party, then maybe you can run the country. And similarly, Rachel Reeves and Starmer for the last 5 years, they've not been able to show business what they represent, but they've been able to tell them, and in a way that's always going to be so. But we're now at the point where businesses small and large can judge them on the letter of policy itself.
Are you a fan of Jimmy's Jobs of the Future? Hi, I'm Sonny, one of the producers behind the show. Have you ever thought, my business deserves to be in the spotlight too? Well, you're not alone. Companies reach out to us all the time, asking us to create podcasts and digital video content for them. But until now, we've only taken on a limited amount of projects. But here's the good news. In 2025, we're expanding. Our production company, Boxlight, is now ready to help more businesses like yours tell their stories with high-quality, white-label content. Curious to see what we can do or how much it might cost? Head over to boxlight.io. You'll find examples of our work and even a podcast calculator to explore your options. That's boxlight.io. We'd love to help you shine in 2025. Now, back to Jimmy.
What does the modern Labour Party... I'm sort of trying to sort of zoom out from kind of like the book and the day-to-day of Westminster. Like, what does the modern Labour Party's kind of like economic standpoint... What is it? What does it sort of view of it? And particularly when it comes to jobs, right? Because it's where the Labour Party does really interest me in the sense of it was founded on the basis of, standing up for jobs and, getting as many people into work as possible, etc., giving them rights and so on. And yet, as you say, what they've done with Nix is like quite surprising in terms of like it's hit the lowest pays, although not directly, it's hit the businesses that kind of employ them. I'd just be really interested in your kind of like assessment of what is the sort of Starmer economic vision.
Well, I guess parties reveal themselves. The soul of a party or a leader or a movement or a moment in politics reveals itself when their backs are against the wall. And you can definitely say that about the budget, right? They had a load of choices to make in that budget, i.e. we've got a huge fiscal headache. How do we alleviate it? We could, as the Treasury will probably tell you, believe did tell them, if you whack 2% on VAT, that's a massive revenue raiser. They didn't do that. They didn't put up income tax. They didn't reverse the Tory nick cuts. What did they do? They taxed the bosses of people who are employed by other people, even if that's in an SME with 3 employees, right? So that's very revealing, right? How they conceive of Labour people when the government is extremely limited politically and fiscally in what it can do. And it's that idea that, we are for the people who work for other people and live, and and they got down such a rabbit hole in the election campaign trying to find working people. Yes. But it is that sense of the numbers on my pay slip are the be all and end all of my financial well-being. I mean, that's true for most of us, of course, but it's like, the people who will most acutely feel a tenner up, a tenner down, or whatever. Yeah. And it's that key thing, working for other people. Now, that's actually quite a flat and reductive view of the world, right? Because, just look to France and look to other parts of the world to see how, to use the example of shopkeepers and Pierre Pujade and other people like that, other movements, that petty bourgeois, lower middle class, the sort of, that sort of sense of, we're aspirational, we run small businesses, but we're not well off. Why are you clobbering us? But, that very reductive take on it, i.e. if you work for someone else, it is the boss who's going to get it in the neck or, the wallet, I think is very revealing about how ultimately, when it comes down to it, these very Labour people, and they are very Labour people even if they're on the right of the Labour Party, most of them have spent their entire adult lives in the Labour Party, thinking about the Labour Party, Pat McFadden, Rachel Reeves and others, despite Rachel Reeves' brief or contested phrase into the banking world, right? Like she is Labour to her bones. That's true of most of the cabinet, and that's how they see the world, and that's ultimately reflected in their quite sort of very big L and small L Labour budget and fiscal choices so far.
I think also there's the possibility that there is no such thing as Starmerism, that we ought to take Starmer's word for it, and that therefore the party just has been boxed in by its own political communication and vocabulary. I wrote a piece last year about the fact that a lot of people within Starmer's inner circle were influenced by this idea from across the pond of deliverism, or rather a critique of it. The deliverist idea states that if you deliver effective policy, then the public will thank you for it. And there are a lot of people who, by the middle point of last year, were saying, well, look at Biden's poll ratings. We're not so sure that there is actually a linear relationship between delivery and outcomes and political reward. And so a lot of people in Starmer's team have felt, well, we need to reflect not only on whether, for instance, in relation to Biden, you can look at the Inflation Reduction Act. With Obama, you can look at Obamacare. Those were massive fiscal endeavours, massive policy programmes, which appeared to have clear outcomes, but which didn't yield any dividend politically almost whatsoever. And a lot of people around Starmer say, well, we need to make sure that people experience the fruits of our policy. It's not good enough to say we've spent 1.2 trillion on a programme. People need to feel it, and that sort of is part of what led to what Patrick was alluding to a few moments ago. Policy, it says we're going to make sure that people feel they've got more money in their back pockets, and that possibly forced them in the direction of indirect taxes.
Yeah.
It's one of the great counterfactuals. What did Rachel Reeves actually need to promise in order to win power? There, all these promises on taxes, which have ended up boxing them in, but also they possibly boxing themselves in politically, and that has led to the closest approximation of Starmer's economic philosophy.
And one thing we haven't spoken about in all this, by the way, is Angela Rayner's workers' rights agenda.
Yes.
And I think that's reflective of how Labour sees jobs and work and bosses and employers. The analysis basically is that too many employers are unscrupulous, that work is, doesn't pay enough, that it's a bit rubbish, that you are getting screwed over by your boss. And obviously that's certainly true in lots of cases. But I guess if you're, on the flip side, if you are a responsible small business owner who tries to do best by their workers, you're looking at the Labour Party and probably not feeling a lot of love right now, because it's, we're going to tax you even more, your margins are going to be even tighter. And by the way, we don't think you're a particularly nice person, and so we need to put all this regulation on you, despite at the same time talking about growth and letting it rip and deregulating, etc., etc. So it's full of contradictions.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that's the thing. They put in so much effort prior to the election, and they just seem to have sort of spent a lot of that kind of political capital that they built with businesses. I also think businesses were, some were a little bit naive with it all, and sort of.
It's like this is a Labour government.
Yeah, exactly, and sort of being, perhaps not getting as many assurances as they could have done out of it. I mean, I think the sort of the collapse of the CBI during that sort of year is a very interesting sort of, again, kind of counterfactual.
Yeah,
because I just think that this was a Labour government. It was always going to do this. And look, after 14 years of the Conservatives, particularly what they put the country through in the last 4 years of that, it's not a surprise that people were ready for a change. But business leaders sort of, seem to do quite, they seem to give away a lot quite easily. And I think it is interesting that, to be fair, Labour have got some really credible business people sort of backing them. They obviously brought in James Timpson as Prisons Minister, which is interesting. Richard Walker, CEO of Iceland as well, was a very kind of prominent campaigner. And in the book as well, Greg Jackson, the chief executive of Octopus Energy, was on the candidates list as well.
Well, he was vetted. He was among several public figures vetted for parliamentary seats. Everyone had to go through this very arduous vetting process. Whether Greg Jackson volunteered or they wanted to tap up Greg Jackson is a question we don't get into. But certainly he was a name people at the very top of the Labour Party hoped and maybe expected would be a Labour MP at this point. But alas not. Who knows what happened?
Who knows what happens? But I do think it's just generally, I mean, obviously I would say this one right, but it's very interesting to see how business and politics, and particularly given everything that's happening in the States as well in terms of Musk, whether more people are kind of going to be involved in it as well. One of the things that struck me in the book was just how unprepared they were for government. And you talk about goodwill and momentum being very important early on in a government, and if you lose those things, then you're in trouble. I could not believe the stories about the grid being empty. And I just sort of think you talk about Starmer being this sort of very serious kind of professional person, prioritises that above all else. And yet, okay, fine, slightly caught on the hop by there being an election a bit earlier than they'd anticipated. But it just seems extraordinary that there wasn't a plan.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that there's a sort of tension within the way that Starmer operates, which is, yes, he does prize competence and efficiency, and Patrick used the word serious. He likes the idea of having a serious operation, but he also delegates. And I think that he will rue the day not just that he delegated power to Sue Gray, but that he alighted on this very curious division of Labour where McSweeney oversaw the politics and Gray oversaw government preparation. And those who've been in government will tell you that there can be no division between politics and government, that they're one and the same, and they have to address and exist in a sort of equilibrium with each other. And I think that you said it was shocking. I mean, we were shocked because the cupboard was basically bare at the beginning. A lot of the preparing for government work ended up being subsumed by personality politics, by office politics, by things as simple as Sue Gray not appearing to like or trust a person enough for them to be deemed capable of speaking to Simon Case about the work of their department or speak to the permanent secretary of their bit of Whitehall. And in the end, I think that it's very easy to partake in sort of demolition derby on Sue Gray, and you refer to the grid, this sort of all-powerful document in Westminster that determines what the government's announcing on a given week. But Starmer too, I mean, it cannot be that he is transcendentally serious and yet also didn't double check that they had a plan for government. That his tour, by the way, of the regions and nations, the very first thing he did upon getting into Downing Street was planned at it's not even fair to say the 11th hour, it was planned after polling day. Such was the lack of detail in their plan. So he did realise, Starmer being occasionally ruthless, that she had to go, but the damage of that first 100 days still sort of defines a part of the government's political situation, because they never managed to recover the slender lead that Starmer enjoyed in those first few weeks.
Why do you think they were sort of... It just seems so strange and counter to Starmer's sort of persona, because there's this sort of idea that kind of like comes across, I think, with Labour, which is like Tories were terrible and like essentially we'll go in, will provide political stability. That means there'll be economic stability. That will unlock growth. We'll make better decisions. We'll listen to the civil service and we'll take better decisions than the Conservatives because we're not ideologically driven, and therefore we'll perform better government. And that just seems like such a naive view of how it all works.
I think they did. It's certainly true up to the point that was the analysis, by the way. The idea that things have been so unstable, everybody will breathe a massive sigh of relief that we're in, and then they manage to create their own kind of instability. It's really difficult to understand. I think, we come close to answering parts of it, but just how it happened. Look, I think if your chief of staff is trying to sack your heads of policy and comms the week before the election, as Sue Gray was, if your head of communications is only told he has a job at 4 p.m. on polling day, then obviously it's going to be a complete mess. And, Simon Case, for much of the period, the transition talks period, was sort of sat there saying, am I ever going to meet someone who isn't Sue Gray here? Because there's a hell of a lot of stuff I want to talk about with you guys. Why haven't I met the head of comms or policy? Or right, that's because Sue is trying to sack them. It's all very, very, very odd. And by that point as well, there's sort of the internal politics have become so toxic that Sue Gray needed to be seen to fail by her internal opponents. So in a sense that it happened by design as much as by accident. I mean, we were speaking to people as early as January 2024 who were saying to us, this Sue thing is a complete disaster. She could lose us the election. I mean, that was a bit hysterical. But anyway, it's never going to work. And they were right. But Keir Starmer had made the choice to delegate in the way that he had. And he was never going to be convinced by, bluntly, people briefing us in the Times and Sunday Times that they didn't like Sue, or this thing's gone wrong or that thing's gone wrong. It reached a point where the only thing that was going to get rid of Sue was a terrible start to government. And indeed, that's what happened. But it came at the cost of momentum, looking serious, and indeed that crucial stability. But also, you can blame Sue Gray, you can blame Wahid Ali. The book stops with Starmer ultimately, and I think you're right to put your finger on that sense of seriousness. There are lots of people who admire Keir Starmer will say it's a mark of maturity and his disdain for political culture and its trivialities that he's not ringing me up at 3 a.m. in the morning like Ed Miliband used to, saying, why is there a stray semicolon in this press release? Or like, have you seen what Bill Keegan's written in The Guardian about my latest economic policy? Keir Starmer's not doing that, but nor is he sweating the small stuff of leadership. You know, some of the people who'd worked on the 97, 2001, 2005 campaigns who were working on the 2024 campaign, you know, senior people, were sort of baffled that Keir Starmer met them at the start of the process and was basically like, all right, well, you guys run the campaign, you guys run the strategy, I'll see you on the other side. And they were sort of thinking, well, it's great that we're just here thrashing it out, but I grew up watching Tony and Gordon butt heads and really have detailed conversations, you know, Tony Gordon and Peter and Alistair, and Keir Starmer's just not there. So it's unsurprising that if the Prime Minister is sort of something between a non-executive chairman, absentee landlord or master delegator, that things might not have a clear sense of direction.
What do you think drives Starmer? Why is he doing all this? Because it's quite a decision. Like, you know, going through the new Labour intake, I was really struck by the amount of them that are young and sort of under the age of 35, right? And people want to, you know, impact, make change, see politics as the way to do it. You know, he went into it much later in life, having done a public service job. Like, it's a far more considered decision, perhaps. Yet there is still this sort of question that overhangs the whole book and the end of it of what is Keir Starmer for?
So let's just get one thing straight, which is you're not alone in having posed that question, and it extends to people who work closely with him. In our last book, Left Out, we spoke about Paul Mason, the leftist journalist and commentator, having been part of Starmer's inner sanctum in 2019 when he was contemplating the leadership. And they had this various sessions with him where they thrashed out the ideas, the pitch, the membership, but also trying to get a greater feel for him, because, you know, the coalition between the soft left and Starmer was incidental. There was nothing preordained about it. It wasn't like Corbyn and McDonnell who'd been championing that cause forever. It was a transactional relationship. And Mason said to Starmer, well, what is it that you are about? What do you want to give effect to by becoming a leader? What, you know, we're at A, what does B look like? And in the end, they developed something which I think felt quite unsatisfactory to those present, which was, well, Keir doesn't like seeing an injustice and walking idly by, which is not dissimilar to what Patrick was saying about children at Alderhay Hospital, the experiential Starmer, the man who doesn't necessarily have policy prescriptions or ideology, but has values, and values that demand out of him action in a given scenario. But for me, I think that only goes so far. I think that there's also a deep competitiveness to the man. And we spoke to Martin Plout, a friend of Starmer's from his constituency, who, I should say as a compliment, described him as a hard bastard. You know, he described him as somebody who was ultra competitive, not only with those around him, but with himself, and somebody who at every juncture in his career has sought to get to the top. He didn't just want to be a human rights barrister. He wanted to write the textbooks on it. He did. He didn't just want to be a barrister who was on one side of the courtroom. He wanted to be, you know, involved in it from the other side of the telescope. He became head of the CPS. He didn't just want to become a Labour MP. He wanted to become the leader of the party. I think there is a work ethic, a self-improvement ethic, and a deep desire to be at the top and to win that drives him on as well. And in the book, one of the opening passages in the prologue is Starmer McSweeney being upbraided by Vic Starmer, by the Prime Minister's wife, because only moments after the exit poll, when they're at the Tate at the victory party, cruising up the elevator in what should be a moment of gay abandon and unbridled delight, the two men were bemoaning the fact that they had fallen agonisingly short of Blair's landslide in 1997. That is not the sort of thing a normal person does.
Yes.
You have corrected, you've bent history to your will, you have defied years, almost, more than a decade, but almost decades of Labour not winning, and the best thing you can produce is a sort of wary, all right, Vic, I'll shut up now and be grateful for this. That's an unorthodox and deeply competitive persona that does that.
Do you think there's an aspect of where he sort of sits on the neurodiverse sort of spectrum, as it were? Because I think there's
Patrick, take that one.
There's a very interesting bit in the book which made me sort of really sort of stop in my tracks, was the bit about Diane Abbott and her sort of being suspended from the party and her having this conversation with him in the chamber after the debate where she wasn't able to speak. And, he was saying to her, is there anything that I can do? Let me know, Diane. And she was like, yes, restore the whip. And she sort of had to say it twice. And I just found it sort of very, like, there's almost sort of, like, we get it a lot with people on the podcast. Yeah, a lot of very successful people do sit on that neurodiverse spectrum.
It's an interesting question. It's not one
We've never been asked.
Yeah, weirdly, it's, never been asked that question, and we've never asked it, and that's partly because one of the eternal paradoxes of Starmer is that the non-political Starmer is probably the most neurotypical person you could imagine being described to you. Like, he is just somebody's dad. He's a dad from North London who likes his football. He's good chat in the pub, but there's something about the performance of politics, maybe the inherent pretense of politics. Like, we all know politicians reasonably well, don't we? And they have to be on. You can never be truly off, can you?
Yeah.
And I think coming to politics late in life means that there is something stilted, robotic about his public performance. It's been a big change for him. So I think nobody's ever suggested that it's that. And also, I guess he's had a very difficult childhood that involved bottling stuff up and not talking to people about it. So I think it's sort of, maybe a set of emotional responses. I'm not remotely qualified to diagnose these conditions in people.
We're journalists, so we'll do it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. We've just written a book full of heavy inferences, about people and their souls, etc. But no, I think everybody says, the private Keir is the most normal and straightforward guy you could ever hope to meet.
Justin. Gazing slightly into the future, around about 18 months' time, you were talking about the sort of division of, government, politics, etc. They are going to be in a situation where they need to start thinking about the next general election campaign. What kind of happens to Morgan McSweeney and the Downing Street operation at that point? Because if he's the sort of Linton Crosby-esque figure, like, is he going to go back into Labour HQ and be focused there? Or, what will the plan be? What does the future of Starmer's Downing Street look like, do you think?
Look, in principle, McSweeney has sought to set in motion a much more insurgent and political form of government than that which defined not only the first half year of Starmer's premiership, but also the tail end of Sunak's. He is constantly seeking to remind people at political cabinet and in the party full stop that the party has reform breathing down its neck. There's a whole constellation of seats in the northeast in particular where reform was second party by a whisker. There's sort of no complacency when you speak to the man, or when cabinet ministers and MPs speak to the man about the threat that the party faces. And as long as the right is fragmented, the party has a bit of time. But the sort of stated purpose of the government is to array its resource and channel its policy, in order to address these anxieties that have fueled the rise of the populist right. And I mean, as early ago as before the election itself, we were speaking to people in Labour High Command who were already contemplating how we're going to characterise reform and the Tories on the other side of the election. They're already teasing out phrases and straplines and images that they thought would be helpful in sort of repudiating populism. I think Coalition of Chaos was one of them to describe the sort of Tory reform nexus. But no, look, they're very conscious of the sort of political threat posed not by the usual adversaries, the Tory party, but by reform. And I think if we did have McSweeney sat here, he would say that the way they're going to address that is not by conceiving of a effective or amusing slogan or planning the election campaign a bit earlier than they otherwise might, but by addressing it in government. And there are only a very finite number of levers one can pull in government, and especially short to medium term ones. A lot of the pro-growth strategies, things like Heathrow, will bear fruit in a decade's time. So, I mean, the real objective is going to be, can we give effect to policy that has a tangible effect by the time of the next election? Yeah,
it's a government run by electioneers. There's a continuous thread from the 2024 campaign to the 2029 campaign and the bits in between unless, Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney fall out. I mean, they haven't over the book, so I presume they're safe forever. But, it's sort of, this is a government that is thinking primarily in terms of not of a grand theory, Starmerism. It's not like, well, finally we get the chance to implement this philosophy we've been talking about. And even Blairism, which was the ultimate electoral machine, had a philosophy and, public services and the economy, etc., etc. Starmer doesn't. And so the strategy and the policy of the government is being driven first and foremost by the essay question, which in Downing Street is now, how do we hold the line for moderate social democracy / the centre full stop against reform? And we are working backwards from that, as opposed to, this is our theory, this is our philosophy, and we're going to, think about it. It's the election that is guiding the policy and the strategy, even at this early stage. So I think, there'll be a through line right up until the election campaign.
It is interesting. You made me think when saying that McSweeney and Starmer will be the longest serving Prime Minister and Chief of Staff combo that we've basically had since Ed Llewellyn and David Cameron. You think the Chief of Staff role has been through so many individuals over the last sort of and it's a very interesting relationship that does sort of evolve in the over the course of time as well. We've got a few sort of quick fires. Just if you could sort of, and also just if you could recount some of the stories and sort of like things that we can clip and whatever. But what's the biggest misconception about Keir Starmer?
Oh, that's a good one. I think that.
I had to know that one. Biggest misconception. I think that there's a difference between not being political and being interested in politics. I think he's profoundly disinterested in politics, but he is capable of acting politically. And I think that the great evidence we advance in favour of that thesis is how Starmer plotted his path to leadership from well before anybody could have imagined. So maybe the idea is not political. We try to complicate a little in the book.
And a great example of that is we're going to reshuffle Angela Rayner story, which is just mad listening back to it. Talk us through what they tried to do there.
It's a weekend that lives long in the memory of everybody who had the misfortune to be involved. So the Hartlepool by-election has just happened. Labour have lost disastrously. There is literally a blimp of Boris Johnson flying over this seat that's been Labour for nearly 100 years. It is a nightmare. Keir Starmer goes back to London, tells his staff, I'm going to resign. That's it. I'm losing seats that Corbyn held on to. That's the ultimate humiliation. Goodbye. His aides panic. Morgan McSweeney arrives back from Hartlepool, proverbially slaps Keir Starmer around the chops and says, pull yourself together. We're going to change the Labour Party. Don't you remember that paper I sent you a couple of months ago that me and Peter Mandelson wrote? It's all about reshuffling the shadow cabinet, a big symbolic confrontation with the left, a new policy agenda that moves away from Corbynism. It's going to be fine. It's going to be rocky. You go on TV and use the word change repeatedly, which he did in a clip that contains our favourite line said by Keir Starmer ever, which was changing the things that need changing, and that's the change that I will bring about. And so the first phase of this change agenda is a new shadow cabinet. Now, Angela Rayner, for the first year of Keir Starmer's leadership, has been very frustrated. She's deputy leader. She's chair of the Labour Party. She's meant to be running its election campaigns, but she's being frozen out. Now, at the same time, Keir Starmer's team do not trust Angela Rayner. She's ambitious. She's got links to the left of the party and the unions. It's been an arranged marriage, in Angela's words. They don't really get her and don't want to empower her. So there's a lot of bad feeling. And, bear in mind, she's at least bears titular or not nominal responsibility for the Hartlepool defeat. So it's a Saturday in Labour HQ. Angela Rayner rocks up. She arrives in Labour HQ, and on her spokesman's phone is a text from one Gabriel Pogrund saying, "Hi there, mate. I hear Angela's just about to be sacked as chair of the Labour Party." And she storms into the office where Keir Starmer is waiting and says, "I know what you're about to say. You're going to sack me." She storms out. Keir Starmer and his aides are sort of sat there thinking, we were just going to make you shadow health secretary or something. We've not sacked you. But Angela Rayner, goes to the pub, turns her phone off. Keir Starmer, it reaches 5:30 in the afternoon. He says, well, forget this, I'm going home. And there ensues a weekend of quite frantic shuttle diplomacy between the two teams, where it's clarified that no one actually really wanted to get rid of Angela Rayner entirely. They just want to put her in a job that makes better use of her talents. Angela's mates, her close confidants, are saying challenge for the leadership. There's some discussion about, if Keir doesn't give us what we want, we're going to organise a rally of 5,000 people. Union leaders are ringing Angela Rayner saying, challenge him for the leadership, we've had enough. But by Sunday night, after a very long day in the leader's office in Westminster, Keir Starmer has agreed to give Angela Rayner a 24-word job title, and they agree never to speak of any of this again, which hasn't stopped people speaking about it constantly. But it was a reminder of Angela Rayner's political power.
Yes. Angela Rayner versus Boris Johnson would have been boxed.
It would have been.
Really would have been. Who is Starmer's Mandelson, do you think?
I'm not going to. I don't think I'm going to surprise any listeners by saying. It's absolutely McSweeney, and one of the subplots of the book, by the way, is the relationship between Mandelson and McSweeney. The Prince of Darkness, as he was known, now has acknowledged that he didn't notice the young McSweeney at Millbank, the party's headquarters, when he arrived on the scene in the early noughties. And Tony Blair went on the record to say to us, well, he sure as hell notices him now. And he sure as hell knows who he is now. There's no doubt that one of the early big beasts of New Labour to recognise the talent of McSweeney was Mandelson, and one of the sort of key sort of social dynamics of the book is that over the course of the first year or so of Starmer's leadership, there were weekly dinners at the home of Lord Liddell, a very close friend of Mandelson's. Mandelson, Liddell, McSweeney, Streeting's partner Joe Dancy, various other people who are now much more familiar to the public would hold court, critically in the absence of one Keir Starmer, and strategise how to bring the party back towards its Blairite tradition.
And there's a great story that you have in the book about sort of like, and I think this is, you say early on in it that this is not sort of, this is not a book about sort of campaigns and out on the streets. This is a book that's, a lot of it is centred on sort of London dinner parties, which I think, is where a lot of this stuff
it is,
happens.
yeah.
But you've got this great tale of sort of Gove and McSweeney being at dinner together.
It's one of our favourite stories in the book. So, just before the election was called, sort of last spring, Michael Gove is invited to a dinner at the South London home of a mutual friend he shares with one Morgan McSweeney. Now, at the time, Gove has announced he's standing down, but he's still in Rishi Sunak's cabinet. He'll be all over the media during the election campaign. And he goes to meet Morgan McSweeney at this dinner. And the point of it is for the two men to meet and for Morgan McSweeney to basically mine Michael Gove for advice. And the first thing Michael Gove says to Morgan McSweeney is, well, you do know I'm going to have to say lots of horrible things about Keir Starmer during this election campaign. To which Morgan McSweeney goes, that's quite all right. Let's talk about Whitehall. Let's talk about navigating government. Let's talk about the civil service. What works, what doesn't work. Which permanent secretaries did you like working with? Who do you think are duds? How do I run an insurgent government like you did at the Department for Education? And Michael Gove, very, very forthcoming. And I don't think it's a coincidence he's since written a couple of very insightful pieces about Morgan McSweeney in The Spectator.
And Gabe, I'm fascinated by your job. We haven't actually discussed much of what your jobs are, but as Whitehall kind of editor, like, what does that involve? Because I think it's one of the really sort of underreported areas that we focus a lot on the politics. And of course, politics and the people bring it to life. It brings the words, brings manifestos to life. But what is the job of Whitehall editor?
It's a great question. I'm still trying to improvise an answer. The Sunday Times has its place in history of Fleet Street for obviously many reasons, but one is that we created the job of Whitehall correspondent at a time when political reporting was more limited to the sort of conventional lobby system and the inaugural custodian of this role was one Anthony Howard, a man who went on to have a very storied career. But Harold Wilson, at the time, asked his cabinet secretary to thwart Howard and to make sure that the job was a failure. And that's because its objective was to lift behind the veil, explain what was going on in the corridors of power. A lot of people, when they imagine power and politics, think of Parliament and Number 10. The partial job of the Whitehall correspondent has always been to examine power where you're not expecting it, or where you're not allowed to see it. And I'm interested often in not just what's going on physically within Whitehall, which is an actual street between Trafalgar Square and Parliament Square, but also Whitehall in a more expansive sense of the deep state, the establishment, the relationship between the royal family and government, the relationship between government and intelligence, these institutions which, are always concealed from public view, and which, unlike the traditional Westminster lobby, don't have their own core of reporters who are allowed special access to those people. So, to be fair, I might from time to time take a deliberately expansive approach to the job, and I did recently have the privilege of an all expenses paid trip to Bangladesh on business for the paper, examining the business affairs of one Tulip Sadiq, which nobody could accuse of being a Whitehall story. But yeah, the job is to try and tell the public things that politicians and those in power don't want them to know.
And that interaction between institutions reminded me of another great story that you have in the book about Cummings, who believes every institution should be burnt down. But Dominic Cummings goes and sees Team Jeremy Corbyn to sort of talk through, how they could bring the government down.
Yeah, this was in 2018, 2019, when the Corbynites, lots of whom instinctively shared the belief that the EU was a boss's club, that its officials were, in the words of Seamus Mill, the prophets of capital. And they were sort of flailing around looking for a Brexit solution when one of their number, Matt Cousin, former spokesman to Jeremy, very close to the inner circle, gets a Twitter DM saying, "How are you? Love your stuff. I'd like to meet you. Thanks very much, Dominic Cummings." And he thinks, says to his wife, still at home, "I'm going to get whacked. This is definitely MI5." But he meets Cummings, who at the time is, between jobs. He's not yet rejoined the Tory fold. He's run vote leave. He's seen Theresa May balls it up. And he says, first to Zav Cousin, then to James Schneider, Corbyn's head of strategic communications, this is your blueprint for splitting the Tory party, passing a Brexit deal, then winning an election, promising to, fund the NHS and end austerity. That's your roadmap. The alternative is, from my focus groups, he told them, voters in the real world aren't paying attention to anti-Semitism, but they absolutely hate a second referendum, so don't go there. Where do they end up? On a second referendum, because one Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, is pulling them towards it. You've got Dominic Cummings in the shadows saying this is the answer, and you've got Keir Starmer, unbeknownst to not knowing about Cummings, saying no, it absolutely is not. But how different it might have been. Dominic Cummings, he recently told the Sunday Times that if you'd read Bismarck, as he has very closely, you've always got to explore all the options.
Yeah,
and he certainly did.
He certainly did, and largely predicted right.
Well, indeed, he did. Yeah.
Two final questions. I'll let you either of you take them, whatever order that you want. Three actually. That's not true. Well, basically, the questions I've got left, you can take these in whichever order you want. What advice would you give to journalists wanting to kind of break into the profession? Who are the rising stars on the Labour ranks that have been elected from the recent election? And who would make a good celebrity politician, do you think? Ooh. So I'll let you take those in whichever order you want. I'll be told off now for asking too many questions at once. But yeah.
Maybe I'll just start with the one on journalism.
Serious one.
I don't regard myself as certainly not a old ghost of Fleet Street. I mean, we've not been here for that long.
Yeah, but that's why your advice is better, because you've actually done it more recently, right?
I do sometimes say that. Yeah. It's the stories that people tell you of coming up through the local press and regional press.
Exactly.
They entail they involve decisions which people couldn't make now because the institutions don't exist in the same way. So what I always say is start now. You don't need to get a degree to be a journalist. You don't need a license to practice. It's not being a lawyer or a doctor. You can begin any day, and if you have ideas, you can develop them and you can contact people. The only thing you need is a plausible manner and some rat-like cunning, and that generally stands you in good stead. And also, there are all these tools which we're lucky to have, things like the Freedom of Information Act. Any old person can send. So I always say, don't wait to be in a newsroom with a permanent position and a salary, a remunerative role and a title. Just start. Contact other journalists, say you've got a thought, send FOI requests, go to courtrooms or local council meetings which nobody goes to anymore. And if you have the vim and dedication to do that, you will get stories. Great advice.
And pick up the phone and ring people and speak to people and ask people questions, and don't be afraid of silence. I completely agree with everything Gabriel says. Try and go where nobody else is going and ask the questions and be nosy. I mean, it's in many ways the greatest job in the world, because you have a license to, in a figurative sense, there is no license, of course, as Gabriel said, but you can ring anybody you want and ask them something in the public interest. If this was that Michael McIntyre show when he gets people's texts up on the screen, you would see dozens on both of our phones of ridiculous questions or, difficult questions to people in public life. And I think people don't grasp that about journalism, that, it is the art of asking questions and writing down the answers. And it's as simple as that. But ultimately, if you're not willing to pick up the phone or leave the house or, go where other people aren't going, or work late, especially in your early days, or take the job you think is a little bit beneath you or it's not what you want at the time. We both did some weird stuff in the early phase of our careers. I was working while I was at university, 7 a.m. from 11 p.m. Overnight on the Daily Express website, which is not what I imagined doing as a pretentious undergraduate, but I thought I just want to be a journalist. And if you are consumed with that, do whatever it takes, as Gabriel says, and start today.
That would be very funny if Michael McIntyre got some politicians to do that slot, wouldn't it? It would be very interesting. Also, Harry Cole's advice on that was always answer a ringing phone, because that's how he got the Matt Hancock having the affair story, was just answering a ringing, which so many young journalists won't do.
Well, exactly. And always do the thing you don't want to do. I've lost count the number of times I've woken up in the morning and go, I'm hungover, I'm tired, I can't be bothered with this lunch today. Or, I remember once in 2021, a contact said, do you want to go for a pint tonight? And I thought, I'm tired, I can't be bothered. And then I remember being in a terrible pub in Westminster, them getting their phone out, and there was a diplomatic cable in which Joe Biden accused Boris Johnson of jeopardising the Good Friday Agreement. I thought, God, imagine if I hadn't gone to this pint for that. Exactly. So, you've just got to do it. Just do it. The Nike doctrine.
And rising stars on the low benches, who's kind of when you were researching the book, is there any names that were sort of coming up? It's a great weapon.
You do want to give that honorific.
Who are my sources who I can direct this clip to? No. There are.
There's just so many of them.
Right? There are so many of them. Every time you see the telly now, the call of the office is like, sorry, who is that? Where is that? And how is that a Labour MP?
Yeah.
But, the stock answer in Westminster are people like, well, look at the people who've already been made ministers, right? I think that's a good place to start. People like Hamish Faulkner.
Georgia Gould.
No coincidence, by the way, that both of those have very famous Labour surnames.
Do you think they made a bit of a mistake with that? I mean, I can't help but thinking making new MPs, when you've got so many, pointing them, the anointed few, will come back to bite Starmer at some point.
I think it's a good example of Starmer not necessarily accepting the sort of premise of how Westminster works. Sarah Sackman's a really great example. Finchley Gould as Green MP, Solicitor General, given ministerial rank immediately, and he did that because he thinks that she's a seasoned barrister who is conversant in lots of areas of public law, and who therefore would be a very good person to be in the Attorney General's team. And so I think that's just a good example of how Starmer's not that interested in, he'll rather confer his patronage on people who've done things and people who belong to the same faction as him. And, whether that results in a little bit of animus and jealousy on the backbenchers, I think is sort of neither here nor there to him. That could be politically naive, but it is how he operates.
And keep an eye out, I'd say, for the Blue Labour guys. It'll be a test of where this government is going. The four people who've set up, beyond Dan Carden, the former Shadow Cabinet Minister, reformed Corbynite, who is now leading the Blue Labour caucus of MPs. People like Jonathan Brash, David Smith, Jonathan Hinder, sort of red wall MPs who have set up this Blue Labour group. Whether they continue to rise and become more dominant figures on the backbenches, the 2024 Intech MPs, will be a sign of whether the political soul of the Labour Party is really in the Blue Labour zone. So they're worth keeping an eye on.
Brilliant. Well, look, thanks for writing a terrific book. Get in. It's superb. Available in all good bookshops. It's an amazing story of how Starmer basically takes the Labour Party from, almost on the verge of extinction right through to one of the biggest ever victories within the space of 5 years. It's a really interesting read. So thank you very much for writing it and coming on the show. Thanks for having us, Jimmy.
Thank you so much.